The most dangerous air carriers, reconstructing human tragedy. Modern aviation is often presented as one of the safest systems ever built, and in many ways, that is true. But safety in the air is not a single number or a simple promise. It is a delicate balance, held together by engineering, regulation, economics, and human judgment. When one of those elements weakens, risk quietly begins to grow. Over the past few decades, the total number of aviation accidents worldwide has steadily declined. Yet this progress has not reached every corner of the sky. In certain regions, within specific market segments, and among a small number of airlines, danger remains unevenly concentrated. Inside the aviation world, safety is measured layer by layer. Experts look at the age and condition of an airline's fleet. They study patterns of past incidents and fatal crashes. They examine the results of international safety audits and compliance with global operating standards. None of these factors alone tells the full story, but together, they reveal where risk is quietly accumulating. Independent analysts track these patterns year after year. Their rankings are not built for headlines or fear. They are used by regulators, insurers, and governments to identify weaknesses before they turn into disasters. And when decades of data are placed side by side, a pattern emerges. The same airlines appear again and again at the bottom of safety lists. The same names surface on official ban registers. Many operate under severe pressure, flying through mountains and extreme weather, navigating political instability, or surviving with limited funding for maintenance and training. To understand the true scale of the problem, it is not enough to look at individual crashes. The real story lies in what repeats. Historical records show that even large, national carriers have at times suffered not from bad luck, but from systemic failure. The greatest concentration of risk, however, is found among regional and low-cost operators working in environments with weak oversight. In these settings, safety margins erode slowly, maintenance is delayed, training is shortened, crews grow fatigued, schedules are protected at any cost. Aviation disasters are almost never caused by a single mistake. They are the final moment in a long chain of ignored warnings, compromised standards, and human decisions made under pressure. And when that chain finally breaks, the outcome is no longer theoretical. It becomes a reconstruction of human tragedy, measured not in statistics, but in seconds, decisions, and lives lost. Tragedy in the mountains of Mustang. Air operates where most airlines refuse to fly. As a subsidiary of Yeti Airlines, it specializes in routes that cut through the most remote mountain regions of Nepal, places where the Himalayas rise abruptly, weather forms without warning, and narrow valleys turn routine flights into precision exercises. Winds shift violently, visibility disappears in minutes. Pilots often have no choice but to fly by sight alone. These routes are among the most dangerous in commercial aviation, and in just 13 years of operation, Air had already suffered 3 fatal crashes, placing it among the highest-risk carriers in South Asia. On the morning of May 29, 2022, a de Havilland Canada Twin Otter lifted off from Pokhara on what should have been a brief, uneventful journey. The flight to Jomsom was scheduled to last only 20 minutes. On board were 22 people, 19 passengers and 3 crew members. 12 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft vanished from radar. Radio contact was lost above the Koligondaki Gorge, one of the deepest valleys on Earth, where steep walls rise so sharply that signals often fail without warning. When investigators pieced together the final moments, the cause became clear. The aircraft had not suffered a mechanical failure. It had flown, fully under control, directly into the mountainside. Low cloud cover had erased the crew's spatial awareness. The instruments warned of rising terrain, But mountain flying carries a dangerous paradox. In steep landscapes, terrain warning systems trigger constantly, often falsely. Over time, pilots learn to distrust the alarms. Sometimes, they silence them entirely. The wreckage was found nearly 20 hours later, scattered across the slopes of Mount Sanusari, at an altitude of over 4,000 meters. There were no survivors. Among the dead was a single family, whose story would come to embody the quiet cruelty of the crash. Ashok Kumar Tripathi was 54, a business consultant from the Indian state of Odisha. His former wife, Vaibhavi Bandekar Tripathi, 51, worked for a firm in Mumbai. They were in the middle of a painful divorce, legally required to live apart. And yet, they chose to travel together one last time, with their children. Their son, Danish, was 22. Their daughter, Ritika, was 15. The journey was meant to be a pilgrimage to the sacred temple of Muktinath, a place believed to offer liberation from suffering. For the family, it was meant to be something simpler, a pause, a fragile moment of unity before life pulled them permanently in different directions. Ashish Savant, the family's driver, had taken Vaibhavi to work every day for 7 years. He remembered driving them to the Mumbai airport just 2 days before the crash. They were smiling, he said, excited, hopeful. For once, there were no court dates, no paperwork, just time together. After the accident, relatives faced a question no one is prepared for. How do you tell an 80-year-old mother that her entire family is gone? Vaibhavi's mother lay bedridden in her apartment in Thane, dependent on oxygen support. In a single moment, she had lost her daughter, her son-in-law, and both grandchildren. 4 days, the family delayed telling her the truth, knowing that words alone might extinguish what little strength she had left. The story of the Tripathi family is not unique in aviation history, but it is precise, intimate, human. It shows how systemic weaknesses, terrain, weather, compromised procedures, do not end as statistics. They end in ordinary lives, interrupted without warning. In the high mountains, where margins for error disappear, even the shortest flight can become the last. Death on a live stream. On January 15, 2023, Yeti Airlines Flight 691 became the deadliest aviation disaster Nepal had seen in more than 30 years. The aircraft, an ATA-72, was flying a routine domestic route from Kathmandu to Pokhara. It never reached the runway. During its final approach to the city's newly opened international airport, the plane rolled, lost control, and plunged into the gorge of the Seti River. All 72 people on board were killed. At first, nothing about the day suggested danger. The aircraft was mechanically sound. The sky was clear. The air was calm. There were no storms, no turbulence, no external threats pressing in from outside. The disaster unfolded entirely inside the cockpit. As the aircraft prepared to land, one of the pilots reached for the controls. Instead of adjusting engine power, the levers governing the propeller condition were moved into the feathering position. In an instant, thrust collapsed. At low altitude and low speed, there was no room to recover. The aircraft rolled sharply to the left, entered a stall, and dropped out of the sky. There was no warning long enough to correct. No height to trade for time. No margin left at all. But this crash would enter aviation history for another reason. Someone on board recorded it, live. 25-year-old Sonu Jaiswal was traveling with 3 friends from India. Their destination was Pokhara, and their purpose was spiritual. Sonu had recently become a father. After years of waiting, He wanted to give thanks at a sacred temple. This trip was meant to mark the beginning of something new. Minutes before landing, Sonu opened Facebook and began a live broadcast. The video begins calmly. Blue sky fills the frame. Sunlight washes over green hills below the wing. Sonu smiles into the camera, dressed in a yellow sweater. Laughter drifts through the cabin. Passengers chat casually. Nothing feels rushed. Nothing feels wrong. The plane descends low over houses and fields. The ground feels close now, but still peaceful. Then the image begins to shake. Voices rise. Shouts cut through the cabin. The sound of the engines changes. Uneven, strained, wrong. The aircraft lurches. Seconds later, the screen fills with fire. The foam keeps streaming after impact. Flames crackle. Thick black smoke pours into view. The broadcast ends not with silence, but with chaos. Sonu's brother, Deepak, first heard about the crash through the news. He refused to believe it. Accidents feel unreal when they belong to headlines. Then the video surfaced. What words could not confirm, the footage did. Because this tragedy unfolded in public, it forced the world to confront something long ignored: the risks associated with flying in Nepal, where airlines have faced repeated safety warnings and long-standing bans from European airspace. This was not a disaster written by weather or fate. It was a sequence of human decisions, compressed into seconds, captured, transmitted, and witnessed in real time. A private moment, a public ending, and a reminder that sometimes the most devastating failures happen on the clearest of days. A miracle in Karachi. 4 years, Pakistan International Airlines carried a reputation shadowed by neglect. Reports of corruption, inadequate maintenance, and poorly enforced training standards followed the airline across continents. That erosion of trust reached a breaking point in 2020, when authorities revealed that hundreds of Pakistani pilots had obtained their licenses through fraudulent examinations. Against that backdrop, what happened over Karachi was not an outlier. It was the inevitable end of a long decline. On May 22, 2020, Flight 8303 departed Lahore for what should have been a routine domestic journey. As the Airbus A320 approached Jinnah International Airport, the crew prepared to land. They made a critical mistake. The landing gear was never deployed. The aircraft touched down on its engines instead. Metal grinding violently against concrete. Sparks trailed beneath the wings as the plane scraped along the runway for hundreds of meters. Only then did the pilots abort the landing and pull the aircraft back into the air. But the damage was already irreversible. The engines, torn apart by friction, began to fail, one by one. Minutes later, with no thrust left to sustain flight, the aircraft descended helplessly toward the city below. It crashed into the densely populated neighborhood of Model Colony. 97 people were killed, passengers, crew, and residents, on the ground. And yet, amid the wreckage and fire, something almost impossible occurred. 2 people survived. One of them was Zafar Masood. Masood, the president of a major Pakistani bank, had been seated in the very first row of business class. Later, he would recall that the flight felt entirely normal until it didn't. The descent became abrupt. The cabin began to vibrate violently. Panic spread after the first runway impact, when the sound of metal tearing through asphalt echoed through the aircraft. When the plane struck the buildings below, the fuselage disintegrated. Masood's seat, still attached to a fragment of the cabin floor, was ripped free. Through a rupture in the aircraft's body, He was thrown clear of the main wreckage and landed on the roof of a nearby building, just beyond the heart of the fireball that instantly consumed the remains of the plane. People who rushed to the scene described an image that felt unreal. A man in a business suit, lying among smoke and debris. Masood was alive. He was conscious, despite severe injuries, fractures, burns, shock. Around him, the destruction was total. Many of the victims were burned so severely that identification would take weeks, relying on genetic analysis rather than recognition. The second survivor, Muhammad Zubair, escaped from the rear of the aircraft. Disoriented and choking on smoke, he followed a faint sliver of light through a tear in the wreckage. Moments before flames overtook the cabin, he jumped clear. The Karachi crash triggered immediate international consequences. Flights were suspended, oversight intensified, and Pakistan International Airlines became a global symbol of what happens when institutional decay, human error, and technical neglect are allowed to compound unchecked. In this disaster, survival was not earned through training or preparation. It came down to position, to physics, to a fraction of a second that separated life from the inferno. The curse of the 737 MAX. Lion Air rose fast. Through aggressive expansion and relentless cost control, the Indonesian carrier became one of Asia's largest low-cost airlines. But its growth was shadowed by persistent criticism, concerns about maintenance standards, crew discipline, and operational pressure that followed the airline for years. In October 2018, Lion Air became the first airline to expose a flaw that would later ground an entire aircraft program worldwide. The plane was Boeing's newest creation at the time, the 737 MAX 8. On the morning of October 29th, Lion Air Flight JT610 departed Jakarta, bound for Pangkal Pinang. 13 minutes later, it was gone, plunging into the Java Sea, with 189 people on board. What investigators uncovered would shake the aviation industry. The aircraft had been caught in a battle with its own software. A system known as the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, MCAS, was designed to automatically push the aircraft's nose downward under certain conditions. It relied on inputs from a single angle of attack sensor. When that sensor began sending false data, the system activated repeatedly. Each time the pilots pulled back on the controls, the software forced the nose down again. They were not told this system existed. They were not trained on how it behaved. They were fighting an enemy they could not see. The aircraft descended relentlessly, driven not by gravity alone, but by code, until it struck the sea at high speed. Among the dead was Andrea Manfredi. He was 26 years old. An Italian professional cyclist, a rider for the Bardianisi SFE team. He had competed across Europe, building a reputation not only for talent, but for discipline and ambition. Andrea had traveled to Indonesia during the off-season. He planned to train, to explore new terrain, and to grow a business he had been building alongside his athletic career, a personal line of sportswear. In the days before his flight, he posted photos from Jakarta. They showed energy, momentum, a life moving forward with intention. Then the post stopped. News of his death sent shockwaves through Italy's cycling community, but for his family, grief soon collided with something worse. They learned that the aircraft that killed Andrea had already shown serious technical problems the day before the crash, during a flight from Bali. Both Boeing and Lion Air were aware of the anomalies. Maintenance crews worked on the plane overnight and returned it to service. It was a decision that investigators would later describe as fatal. Andrea Manfredi's death became more than a personal tragedy. It became a symbol of systemic failure, of what happens when innovation outpaces transparency, when cost and speed outrun responsibility. He was not lost to weather, not to pilot recklessness, not to chance. The 737 MAX did not simply fall. It was pushed by software logic, by withheld knowledge, and by decisions made far from the cockpit, where their consequences could not be felt. And for 189 people, those decisions became final. Secrets of the Golden Route. For many years, China Airlines carried a reputation it could never fully escape. Throughout the 1990s, a series of fatal accidents earned the airline a place among the most feared in Asia. Routes were nicknamed, rumors spread, trust eroded. Yet none of those disasters would prove as revealing, or as devastating, as what happened to Flight 611. Because this was not a failure born in the moment. It was a failure that waited. On May 25, 2002, a Boeing 747 departed Taipei for Hong Kong, along a heavily traveled corridor known as the Golden Route. The flight was routine. The weather was stable. The aircraft climbed smoothly to cruising altitude. At 10,600 meters above the Taiwan Strait, the plane disintegrated. There was no distress call, no descent, no time to react. All 225 people on board were killed instantly. When investigators began their work, they found no evidence of terrorism, no sign of pilot error, no sudden mechanical malfunction. What they uncovered instead was far more unsettling. The aircraft had been dying slowly. The cause was traced to catastrophic structural failure in the rear fuselage, metal fatigue so severe that the aircraft could no longer contain the pressure of flight. The origin of that failure led investigators back 22 years to a landing in Hong Kong in 1980. During that landing, the aircraft's tail struck the runway. Standard procedure required the damaged section of fuselage to be completely removed and replaced. It was not. Instead, a shortcut was taken. Maintenance crews covered the damaged area with an aluminum reinforcement patch. The wound was concealed. It was never healed. Beneath the patch, microscopic cracks began to form. With every flight, the fuselage pressurized and depressurized. The metal flexed, the cracks lengthened. Too small to detect, too slow to alarm. Year after year, flight after flight. Until, on that afternoon in 2002, the fracture reached its limit. The fuselage tore open. In a fraction of a second, the aircraft broke apart at cruising altitude. There was no scenario in which it could have survived. Among the passengers was a Taiwanese government official, along with more than 100 tourists traveling to mainland China. Search teams scoured the open sea for weeks, but only 175 victims were ever recovered. Autopsies revealed injuries consistent with explosive decompression, lungs ruptured, air force beneath the skin, massive internal trauma. Many passengers likely lost consciousness before they could understand what was happening. For the families, the suffering extended far beyond the crash itself. At a temporary morgue established at Macking Air Base, identification became a slow, exhausting process. Dentists and forensic specialists worked around the clock, matching fragments to records. Families waited in silence as each name was confirmed, closure arriving only hand in hand with grief. One discovery during the investigation carried particular weight. When recovery teams catalogued the 640th piece of wreckage, the tail section itself, they found something unmistakable. On the inside of the reinforcement patch, there were clear signs of long-term oxidation. Pressurized air had been leaking through the crack. 4 years. It was the final proof. The deaths of 225 people were not caused by a single failure or a single mistake made that day. They were the consequence of a decision made more than 2 decades earlier, a compromise accepted, hidden, and forgotten. Flight 611 did not fail in 2002. It failed in 1980. The reckoning simply took time to arrive. Explosion over Mogadishu. In February 2016, Dullo Airlines faced a threat that did not come from weather, mechanics, or pilot error. It came from inside the cabin. Flight 159 was a routine departure from Mogadishu, operated by an airline accustomed to flying in one of the most unstable regions in the world. On board was a 55-year-old man named Abdullahi Abdisalambola, a teacher at an Islamic school. Hidden inside his luggage was an improvised explosive device, concealed within a laptop computer. He did not act alone. Airport security at Aden International Airport had been compromised. One officer handed the device directly to Bola, inside the departure lounge, allowing it to pass through screening, without inspection. The original plan was far deadlier. The intended target was a Turkish Airlines flight, scheduled to depart earlier that day, but weather intervened. The flight was cancelled. The plan collapsed. Forced to adapt, the attacker boarded Flight 159 instead. 15 minutes after takeoff, as the aircraft climbed through roughly 3,300 meters, the bomb detonated. The explosion tore a hole in the fuselage, large enough for a human body. Metal peeled outward. Air rushed violently from the cabin. Passengers screamed, as the structure of the aircraft was suddenly exposed to open sky. And yet, in a grim reversal, the bomber became the only person to die. At that altitude, the cabin was not yet fully pressurized. The blast did not trigger catastrophic structural failure. Instead, the rapid outward airflow pulled Bola through the opening and ejected him from the aircraft. His body was later found on the ground, nearly 30 kilometers from Mogadishu. Inside the cockpit, Captain Vlatko Vodopovic fought to keep the aircraft airborne. Against all odds, he stabilized the damaged plane and turned back toward the airport. Minutes later, Flight 159 landed safely. Passenger videos recorded moments after the explosion show a scene that feels almost unreal. Oxygen masks dangling from the ceiling, people frozen in shock, seated less than a meter from a jagged hole in the aircraft's side. Beyond the torn metal, only clouds and open sky. 74 passengers survived. Investigators later concluded that a single delay, just 1 hour, had made the difference between survival and annihilation. Had the explosion occurred at cruising altitude, where cabin pressure is far higher, the fuselage would have failed completely. The aircraft would have broken apart in midair. There would have been no survivors. This incident stands as a reminder that in aviation, outcomes are not always decided by intent or design. Sometimes, they are decided by timing, measured in minutes, and altitude, measured in meters. Scaryana and the miracle at Gatwick. Scaryana Afghan Airlines was shaped by war, long before it was shaped by aviation. As the oldest airline in Afghanistan, its history unfolded alongside decades of conflict, instability, and collapse. Over more than 25 years, its aircraft were fired upon, hijacked, and forced to operate in conditions few civilian crews ever encounter. Pilots were trained to land in steep, spiraling descents, not for efficiency, but to avoid gunfire. As accidents mounted and standards eroded, the airline earned a grim nickname among aviation professionals. They called it Scaryana. On January 5, 1969, one of its aircraft, a Boeing 727, operating Flight 701, approached Gatwick Airport through dense winter fog. Visibility was near zero. The runway was invisible until the final moments. The crew was inexperienced with jet operations in such conditions. As they configured the aircraft for landing, a critical error was made. With the wing flaps, lift vanished. The aircraft slipped below its proper glide path. There was no recovery. Seconds later, the jet tore through a residential house in the village of Fernhill, the home of the Jones family. The impact obliterated the building. All 48 people on board the aircraft were killed instantly. Inside the house, Mr. and Mrs. Jones were also killed. The crash should have left nothing alive, but one person survived. Their young daughter was asleep in her bedroom. As wreckage collapsed into the house, something improbable happened. The walls of the child's crib folded inward. Instead of shattering, they formed a rigid frame around her. Debris piled on top. One of the aircraft's engines, among the heaviest components of the jet, came to rest directly above the crib. It was suspended by fragments of the structure. The weight should have crushed everything beneath it. It did not. Fire swept through the room. Smoke filled the air. The house burned and the improvised shelter. But it held. When police officer Keith Simmons arrived, among the flames and debris, he expected to find only remains. Instead, he heard a sound. The child was alive. She was terrified, shaken, but almost unharmed. The crash at Gatwick became one of the most extraordinary survival stories in aviation history. A miracle not born of skill or design, but of collapse behaving in exactly the wrong and right way at the same time. For Scaryana Afghan Airlines, the disaster cemented a reputation that would follow it for decades. An airline synonymous with danger, misfortune, and loss. Yet its most enduring legacy would not be the wreckage scattered across Fernhill. It would be a single life spared, at the very center of total destruction. In aviation history, most stories end in failure. And sometimes, rarely, they end with survival, where none should have been possible. Tragedy in the fog over Almaty. Scat Airlines had carried quiet warnings for years. The Kazakh carrier was repeatedly criticized for operating an aging fleet and for safety practices that lagged behind international standards. Those concerns became impossible to ignore. On January 29, 2013. That morning, Flight 760, a Bombardier CRJ-200, approached Almaty International Airport in dense fog. Visibility was severely reduced. The runway was hidden somewhere ahead, unseen. As the crew attempted to abandon the landing and initiate a go-round, something went catastrophically wrong. Instead of climbing, the aircraft pitched sharply downward. Seconds later, it slammed into the ground at extreme speed, roughly 1.5 kilometers short of the runway. The impact was unsurvivable. Investigators later discovered that the elevator, the control surface responsible for pitch, had been driven fully downward. One leading hypothesis emerged as both chilling and tragic. The captain, Vladimir Yevdokimov, may have suffered a sudden heart attack at the critical moment. He may have collapsed forward onto the control column, forcing the aircraft into a dive. There was no time to recover. 16 passengers were on board. Among them was 2-year-old Baksan Bakitsan, traveling with his parents. Also killed were well-known regional business figures, people whose lives ended without warning, without turbulence, without chaos. Relatives would later recall a cruel truth. Until the final seconds, most passengers likely believed everything was normal. There were no violent maneuvers, no shouted commands, no sense of emergency, just a routine approach, followed by a sudden, fatal loss of control. The crash sent shockwaves across the region. Inspections were tightened, procedures were reviewed, promises were made. But for 21 families, the lesson arrived too late. When we look at these crashes together, one truth becomes unavoidable. Catastrophe is almost never sudden. It is built slowly, decision by decision, compromise by compromise, until the system can no longer hold. For the passengers, the consequences arrive in seconds. For the families, they last a lifetime. If stories like these matter to you, stories that go beyond headlines, and ask why tragedies happen, consider subscribing. This channel is dedicated to examining real disasters through evidence, patterns, and the human lives behind the data. If you found this video valuable, supporting it with a like helps this work reach more people. And I'd like to ask you something. Which crash in this video affected you the most? And what warning sign do you believe should never be ignored? Let's talk about it in the comments, because many stories remain untold.